The way she said close the door told me this wasn't about the quarterly reports. Her voice had dropped half an octave. That thing she does when she's trying to sound professional, but something else is bleeding through. I closed it. She was standing by the window with her back to me, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. Then she turned around and said, "This is personal, not work." I felt something in my chest shift, not dramatically, just enough. "My name is Marcus Webb, 36. I work in corporate training development, which means I design programs that teach people skills they should already have, and then measure whether they retained any of it. It's detail work, occasionally satisfying when someone actually applies what they learned. I've been at Hendrix Solutions for 4 years. Same building, same slightly too cold conference rooms. Same boss for the last 2 of those years. Her name is Natalie Crane, 38. She runs the entire training and development department, which means she manages 12 people including me, and somehow makes it look easier than it is. She has a leather portfolio that's so worn the corners are rounded smooth. She carries it everywhere. I've seen it in her office, in client meetings, once in the parking garage at 7 in the morning when she was sitting in her car, looking like she'd been crying. We met during my second week when she pulled me into a meeting I wasn't prepared for, and I had to improvise a presentation on learning retention metrics with zero notice. I survived. She smiled afterward and said, "You're either very good or very lucky. Let's assume both." That set the tone for everything that followed. We became the kind of colleagues who worked late together, traded sarcastic commentary during terrible webinars, and trusted each other with projects no one else wanted. Easy, professional, safe. The tension started 6 months ago. Small things. She held my gaze a fraction too long during meetings. She laughed at things I said that weren't particularly funny. She started asking my opinion on decisions that had nothing to do with my role. I told myself I was reading into it, that she was just a good manager who valued input. Then 3 weeks ago, we got stuck working overnight to finish a proposal for a client who had moved their deadline up by a week. It was just us in the office. Around 2 in the morning, she brought coffee to my desk and sat down in the chair across from me. She didn't say anything for a minute. Then she said, "Do you ever feel like you're working twice as hard to avoid something that's right in front of you?" I looked up. She was staring at her coffee cup. I said, "What do you mean?" She looked at me, held my gaze for 1 second longer than felt safe. Then she looked away and said, "Nothing. Forget it. I'm just tired." But her voice dropped just a little, like the sentence had been sitting behind her teeth for months and slipped out before caution could catch it. After that night, things got quieter between us. Not cold, just careful, like we were both trying not to say the wrong thing. She stopped asking me to stay late. She stopped sitting in my office to debrief after meetings. When we passed each other in the hallway, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That bothered me more than the distance did. Then this morning, she sent me a calendar invite. No subject line, just a 30-minute block labeled Marcus, my office. I stared at it for 10 minutes trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. I knocked on her door at exactly 2 o'clock. She said, "Come in." I walked in. She was standing by the window. She looked at me and said, "Close the door." I did. That's when she said it. "This is personal, not work." I stayed where I was. I said, "Okay." She turned to face me fully. She said, "I'm going to say something and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Can you do that?" I nodded. She took a breath. She said, "I know this breaks every rule we have about workplace boundaries. I know it's inappropriate. I know it puts us both in a position that could get complicated. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel. And I can't keep managing you like you're just another person on my team when you're the person I think about first when something happens. Good or bad, it's always you." That landed. I didn't say anything. She kept going. She said, "I've tried to talk myself out of this for 6 months. I've listed every reason why it's a terrible idea. The power dynamic, the HR implications, the fact that if this goes wrong, one of us probably has to leave. And none of it matters, because when I'm working late and you're still here, I don't feel alone. And when you make some dry comment during a meeting that only I find funny, I have to physically stop myself from smiling too much. And 3 weeks ago, when I almost told you how I felt and then chickened out, I went home and sat in my car for 20 minutes hating myself for being a coward." She stopped, She looked at me like she was bracing for impact. She said, "So that's it. That's what I needed to say. You can go now if you want. I won't make it weird. We'll just go back to how it was." I stayed where I was. I said, "Are you finished?" She nodded. I said, "Natalie, you've been looking at me like I'm a problem you can't solve for half a year, and I've been doing the exact same thing back. The only difference is I convinced myself you were just being a good boss. Turns out I have poor survival instincts around women who are smarter than me and don't know how terrifying they are when they care about something." Her breath caught. She said, "Marcus." I said, "I stayed late that night because I wanted to. I stay late most nights because being here when you're here feels better than being home when you're not. And when you almost said something 3 weeks ago and then backed off, I spent the rest of that week wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing or if you were just better at hiding it than I was." She went still, not dramatically, just still. She said, I'm saying that if you're worried about breaking workplace rules, you should know I've been breaking them in my head for months. I just didn't think I had any right to say it out loud because you're my boss, and I didn't want to put you in a position where you felt cornered." She looked like a woman who had just realized her own mouth had betrayed classified information. She said, "So what do we do now?" I said, "I don't know, but I know I don't want to go back to pretending. And I know that whatever the rules are, I'm willing to figure out how to navigate them if you are." She stepped closer. Not much, just enough that the space between us stopped being professional. She said, "This could get messy." I said, "Probably." She said, "People will talk." I said, "Let them." She said, "We might have to disclose this to HR. I might have to recuse myself from your performance reviews. We might have to move you to a different team." I said, "I know." She said, "And you're still standing here?" I said, "I am." She smiled. It was small, real. She said, "I thought you were going to run." I said, "Where exactly would I go? You're the reason I don't hate Mondays." She laughed once. It sounded relieved. She said, "I wrote 3 different versions of what I was going to say today. The first one was too formal. The second one sounded desperate. The third one was what you just heard." I said, "It wasn't desperate, it was honest." She said, "Same thing." I said, "Not even close." She looked at me, held my gaze. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "That night we worked late. What did you want to say when I asked if you were avoiding something?" I said, "I wanted to say that I wasn't avoiding anything. I was just trying not to ruin the one professional relationship I actually valued by wanting something more." She looked away too quickly. She said, "You should have said it." I said, "You didn't exactly make it easy." She said, "I was your boss. I couldn't make the first move." I said, "You just did." We stood there for a while, not talking, just letting the air settle into something new. Eventually, she said, "We're going to have to be smart about this." I said, "Agreed." She said, "No one can know until we figure out the HR piece." I said, "Makes sense." She said, "And we can't let it affect the work." I said, "Obviously." She said, "I'm serious, Marcus." I said, "So am I, but I'm also not going to pretend this didn't just happen." She said, "Good, because I don't think I can go back to managing you like you're just another employee." I said, "I was never just another employee." She said, "I know. That's the problem." She walked to her desk. She sat down. She looked at me and said, "Sit." I sat in the chair across from her, the same chair I had sat in 100 times before, but the distance felt different now. Less careful, more honest. She said, "We need a plan." I said, "For what?" She said, "For how we do this without destroying everything we've built here." I said, "You always need a plan." She said, "Yes. That's why you like working with me." I said, "That's one reason." 3 weeks later, we met with HR. Together, we disclosed the relationship before it became a relationship, which apparently is the responsible adult thing to do. They moved me to a different department, same building, same floor, different manager. It felt absurd. I'd spent 2 years working directly under Natalie, and now I was reporting to someone who barely knew what I did, but it also felt right. Clean, like we were choosing this instead of hiding it. The first time we went to dinner after the transfer went through, Natalie said, "This feels like a first date." I said, "It is a first date." She said, "We've known each other for 2 years." I said, We've worked together for 2 years. That's different. She smiled. She said, "You're right." "So what do people talk about on first dates?" I said. "Probably not quarterly training metrics." She said, "Good. I'm sick of quarterly training metrics." We talked about everything else. Her childhood in Oregon, my terrible college band, the novel she'd been writing for 5 years and never showed anyone, the fact that I couldn't cook to save my life but made excellent toast. It felt easy, like we'd been doing this the whole time and just forgot. 6 months later, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. It was a Saturday. I answered the door in sweatpants. She was holding her worn leather portfolio. She said, "I finished it." I said, "Finished what?" She said, "The novel. All of it. I want you to read it." I took it. I said, "You're the only person I trust with this." I read it that weekend. It was good. Better than good. I told her so. She cried. Not sad crying, the kind of crying that happens when someone sees something in you that you didn't know was visible. 2 years later, when people asked how we got together, Natalie always said, "He worked for me and I broke every HR rule in the book." I said, "That's not the comforting version." "It is accurate." She said, "You love it." I did. Nothing about us had changed. She still overthought everything. I still made dry comments that only she found funny. The difference was that now, when she closed the door to talk about something personal, I didn't have to wonder what she meant. And when I stayed late, it wasn't because I was avoiding going home. It was because home was wherever she was. It wasn't new. It had probably always been her. I just had to wait for her to close the door and say it out loud for me to stop pretending otherwise.